The Law of Dependent Arising. The Secret to Bondage and Release. Sermon 6. By Bhikkhu K, Ñāṇananda. Narrated by Bhikkhu Candana. Sermon 6. Pahankanua Sermon number 188. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage be to the fortunate one, the worthy, fully enlightened. Jati marana samsaraṃ ye vajanti punappunang ittha bhavanyatha bhavaṃ avijjayeva sagati avijjahayang mahamoho ye nidang sangsitang chirang vijjagata cha ye satta nagachanti punabhavam. Dvayatānupassana sutta. Sutta Nibbāna. Those who go on wandering again and again, alternating in samsara between birth and death, are involved in a change from thisness to otherwiseness, which is merely a journey of ignorance. This ignorance is the vast delusion, whereby for long this samsaric journey has gone on. But those that have come by knowledge come back never again to repeated birth. Dear listeners, what is called life is the period between birth and death. What is called samsara is the alternation between birth and death. We have taken up as the topic of our 6th sermon on dependent arising 2 verses that highlight the connection between these two. The 2 verses are found in the Dvayatānupassana Sutta of the Sutta Nibbāna. In the brief introductory story of this discourse, which embodies a lot of deep points in the Dhamma, one can sense an intense fervor of the Dhamma. You had better form a mental picture of a moonlit night at Pubbārama in Savatthi on a full moon day, when the Buddha is seated in the open air, surrounded by the congregation of monks. Having surveyed the company of monks with the Buddha eye as they were seated quietly with rapt attention, the Buddha started a deep sermon with this prologue. Monks, whatever skillful, contributory mental states there are that are noble and effectively leading up to enlightenment, if there are any persons who question about the justifiable purpose of listening to them, they should be told. It is just for the purpose of knowing as it is the dualities in this Dhamma. And what would you call a duality? This is suffering. This is the arising of suffering. This is one mode of contemplation. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path of practice leading towards the cessation of suffering. This is the second mode of contemplation. And therein, monks, of a monk who thus dwells diligently, zealous and ardent, rightly contemplating the dualities, one of 2 results may be expected. Either full comprehension in this very life, or, if there is any residual clinging, the fruit of non-returning. After this initial exhortation, the Buddha uttered 4 verses pertaining to the 4 noble truths. Then again, addressing the company of monks, the Buddha said, Monks, if there are any who put the question, could there be another mode of contemplating correctly the duality? They should be told there is. And how? Whatever suffering that originates, all that is due to assets. This is one mode of contemplation. But with the utter fading away and cessation of assets, there is no origination of suffering. This is the second contemplation. You had better note that what is here called assets or upadhi are the 5 aggregates of grasping we have deposited in this long samsara. So, according to the Buddha, the cause of the entire mass of suffering is the 5 aggregates of grasping. So much so that with the remainderless fading away and cessation of these assets, there is no origination of suffering. In the same way, this discourse introduces as many as 16 modes of contemplation. The special feature is that each mode of contemplation is introduced with the supposition that there are those who question the possibility of another mode of contemplation. Firstly, the Buddha describes the topic under consideration in prose, and then gives 3 or 4 verses concerning its importance as a mode of contemplation. We do not propose to discuss fully all the topics raised in this long discourse, but the special significance of this particular sermon preached by the Buddha is that, at the end of it all, the 60 monks who listened to it attained arahanthood, extirpating all influxes. It is such an important discourse. It is the 3rd mode of contemplation given in this discourse that we have taken up as the topic of our sermon today. Now, this is the statement in prose with which the Buddha introduces the verses relevant to the topic. Yang kinchi dukkhang sambhoti sabbang avidya paccaya avidyayat veva asesa viraga nirodha nati dukkhassa sambhavo. Whatever suffering that originates, all that is due to ignorance. With the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance, there is no origination of suffering. It is after this declaration that the Buddha utters the 2 verses forming our topic. Jati marana samsarang ye vajjanti punab-punang itha bhavanyatha bhavang avidyayeva sagati. Those who keep wandering again and again in this samsara, which is an alternation between birth and death, tantamount to a thisness and otherwiseness, are involved in a journey which is merely a perpetuation of ignorance. Avidya hayang mahamoho ye nidang sangsitang chirang vidyagata cha ye satta nagachanti punabhavam. Ignorance is the great delusion due to which one has wandered long in this samsara. Those beings that are endowed with knowledge do not come back to repeated existence. I wish to discuss these 2 verses in some detail. Let me cite at length a certain highly significant discourse which I touched upon briefly the other day, namely the Kaccayana-gotta sutta of the Samyutta Nikāya. I shall give it in some detail, so that even those of you who were not present the other day could easily follow it. And this is how the discourse begins. A monk named Kaccayana-gotta approaches the Buddha and asks him, "Venerable Sir, right view, it is said. In how far, Venerable Sir, does one have right view?" The Buddha replies, Dvayanissito ko ayang kaccana loko ye bhuyena athitancheva natitancha. Kaccana, this world for the most part rests on a duality, namely existence and non-existence. Then he proceeds to proclaim a wonderful middle path. Kaccayana, to one who sees as it is, with right wisdom, the arising of the world, the view of non-existence about the world does not occur. And to one who sees as it is, with right wisdom, the cessation of the world, the view of existence about the world does not occur. The reference here is to the two views of eternalism and annihilationism. Then the Buddha goes on to say that this world, for the most part, is given to approaching, grasping, and entering into views. Upaya, upadana, abhinivesa, vinibandho. But if one does not approach, grasp, and take one's stand upon that tendency to approaching, grasping, and that mental standpoint with the idea, this is myself, then one would not doubt nor waver about the fact that it is only suffering that arises, and only suffering that ceases. He would have a knowledge of it, which is not dependent on another. With this, the Buddha gives the reply to Kaccayana's question, saying, "Insofar Kaccayana has one right view." In conclusion, he says by way of explanation, Sabbang atthiti ko Kaccayana, ayang eko anto, sabbang natthiti ayang dutiyo anto, ete te Kaccayana ubho ante, anupagamma majjhena tathagato dhammang deseti. Avidya paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya viññāṇaṃ, evametassa kevalassa dukkha khandassa samudayo hoti. Avidyāyatveva asesa viraga nirodha, sankhara nirodho, sankhara nirodha viññāna nirodho, evametassa kevalassa dukkha-khandassa nirodho hoti. Everything exists. This, O Kaccayana, is one extreme. Nothing exists. This, O Kaccayana, is the second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, Kaccayana, the Tathagata, preaches the Dhamma by the middle. Depending on ignorance, preparations, depending on preparations, consciousness. This is the arising of this whole mass of suffering. But with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of preparations. With the cessation of preparations, cessation of consciousness. Thus is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. You are all familiar with the middle path as expounded in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, namely the Noble Eightfold Path, which avoids the two extremes of indulgence in sense pleasures and self-mortification. Now, this Kaccayana Sutta is also a sermon preached by the Buddha. Here, the concept of the middle path is the avoidance of the two extreme views. Everything exists and nothing exists. What does this middle way amount to? The law of dependent arising. As we mentioned earlier, the formula of dependent arising has a direct order and an indirect order. In the direct order, the formula begins with depending on ignorance, preparations, depending on preparations, consciousness, and so on, and ends with the statement, thus is the arising of this whole mass of suffering. In the indirect order, the formula begins by saying that with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of preparations. With the cessation of preparations, the cessation of consciousness, and concludes with the declaration, thus is the cessation of this whole mass of suffering. You had better note the significance of the direct order and the indirect order. Thereby the Buddha evolves a middle path between the above two extreme views. Talking about the middle path, all this time we are used to identifying the middle path with the Noble Eightfold Path. You had better understand the reason for it. It is true that the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta preached to the group of 5 monks is undoubtedly the very first sermon, and as such a great discourse. But there is a particular reason which inspired it. Those 5 monks entertained doubts about the Buddha's enlightenment because he gave up the austerities of self-mortification. That is why the Buddha adopted that mode of presentation of the Noble Eightfold Path as the avoidance of the 2 extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification. All the same, the law of dependent arising is implicit in that discourse. The reason for the point of emphasis was the necessity of convincing them. Unfortunately, however, our commentarial tradition has not taken sufficient cognizance of this aspect of the middle path. Owing to that, quite a number of very important discourses on Nibbāna have remained obscure. A lack of appreciation of the law of dependent arising, or the middle path between is and is not views, is responsible for this neglect. As we pointed out earlier, that spontaneous utterance of the Buddhas, namely, arising, arising, ceasing, ceasing, soon after their realization, sketches out the middle path between those 2 extremes in that it is a reflection of the incessant process of arising and ceasing going on in the world. On various occasions, we have brought up important discourses relating to this particular middle path. One such popular but abstruse discourse is the Bahiya Sutta. The middle path implicit in the Bahiya Sutta is not understood by many who read it. Let us recollect it. Bahiya Daruchiriya was an ascetic with a high degree of samsaric maturity. He had meditated on his own and reached a stage which he took to be arahanthood. A certain deity had pointed out to him that it is an overestimation and directed him to the Buddha. With an intense eagerness, he came to see the Buddha. By that time, the Buddha was on his alms round, and in all haste Bahiya begged him to preach the Dhamma. For some reason or other, the Buddha refused the request twice. But, upon the 3rd insistent request, came out with a wonderfully brief and cryptic sermon, which begins with this initial injunction. Tasmātiha Bahiya evang sikkhitabbaṃ ditte dittamattaṃ bhavissati, sute sutamattaṃ bhavissati, mute mutamattaṃ bhavissati, viññāte viññātamattaṃ bhavissati, evan hite Bahiya sikkhitabbaṃ. Well then, Bahiya, thus should you train yourself. In the seen there will be just the seen. In the heard there will be just the heard. In the sensed there will be just the sensed. In the cognized there will be just the cognized. Thus should you train yourself. Then the Buddha outlines the final outcome of that training. Yato ko te Bahiya ditte dittamattaṃ bhavissati, sute sutamattaṃ bhavissati, mute mutamattaṃ bhavissati, viññāte viññātamattaṃ bhavissati, tato tvaṃ Bahiya natena, yato tvaṃ Bahiya natena, tato tvaṃ Bahiya natatha, yato tvaṃ Bahiya natatha, tato tvaṃ Bahiya nevidha nahuraṃ na ubhayamantarena esevanto dukkhassa. And when, to you, Bahiya, There will be in the seen just the seen, in the heard just the heard, in the sensed just the sensed, and in the cognized just the cognized, then Bahiya, you are not by it. And when Bahiya, you are not by it, then Bahiya, you are not in it. And when Bahiya, you are not in it, then Bahiya, you are neither here nor there, nor in between. This itself is the end of suffering. The implication is that, at whatever time one stops short at the seen and takes it only as a seen and not something seen, and likewise in the case of heard, only as a heard and not something heard, in the sensed only as a sensed and not something sensed, and in the cognized only as a cognized and not as something cognized, that is to say, there is no imagining a thinghood, then one would not be thinking in terms of it. One would not imagine by it, tena, in the instrumental sense, or in it, tatha, in the locative sense. As we said earlier, the problem of samsara lies hidden in the linguistic medium. For instance, in the case of a scene, when one takes the concept of a chair in the substantive sense, there will be by or with the chair, as well as a positing of in the chair, or else, if one does not stop short at the heard but imagines a music in it, there will be a by music and an in music. Thereby one takes a standpoint and tacitly identifies oneself with it. On the other hand, if one does not take such a standpoint, one is neither here nor there, nor in between the two. A middle exists relative to two ends. When one is free from the two ends and does not take a stand in the middle, saying, "This is myself," as stated in the Kaccayana-gotta sutta, one would win to the conviction that what arises is only suffering, and what ceases is only suffering. And that itself is the end of suffering. Then there is another brief but highly significant sutta in the same text, the Nibbāna. It is a sermon specifically dealing with Nibbāna. Nibbāna Patisaṅyutta, which the Buddha addressed to the monks. That sermon, too, appears rather cryptic and riddle-like in its formulation. It is worded as follows. Nissitassa chalitang, anissitassa chalitang nati, chalite asati passadhi, passadhiya sati nati nahoti, natiya asati agati gati nahoti, agati gatiya asati chutu papato nahoti, chutu papate asati nevidha nahurang na ubhayamantarena esevanto dukkhassa. The first two words are probably familiar to you by now. Nissitassa chalitang. The word nissitassa might remind you of the term dvaya-nissita, resting on a duality, in the Kaccayana Sutta discussed above. Nissita has the sense of resting on, leaning on, or being attached to. To one who rests on the duality of eternalist view and annihilationist view, there is unsteadiness, chalitang. If you are leaning on something, when it moves or shakes, you have to move or shake with it. This is the basic principle the Buddha puts forward first of all. Then he gives the converse of that statement. Anissitassa chalitang nati. To one who does not rest or lean on something, there is no unsteadiness or shaking. As it is said in the Kaccayana-gotta sutta, if one does not lean on extreme views by going the middle way, there is no unsteadiness. Anissitassa chalitang nati. When there is no unsteadiness, there is calm. Passaddhi. When there is calm, there is no inclination or bending. Passaddhiya sati nati nahoti. Understood deeply, it means the absence of craving. When there is no inclination, there is no coming and going. Natiya asati agati gati nahoti. When there is an inclining, there is a possibility of falling somewhere, a possibility of coming and going. When there is no coming and going, there is no question of death and rebirth. Agati gatiya asati chutu papato nahoti. When there is no death and rebirth, there is neither a here nor a there, nor in between the two. Chutu papate asati nevidha nahurangna ubhaya mantarena. This itself is the end of suffering. Esevanto dukkhassa. Here too we find the question of linguistic conventions coming in. As we have already mentioned, the knotty problem of samsara can be traced to linguistic conventions which we ourselves have created. Language and logic are transcended in this Dhamma. That is why it is called atakavachara, not moving within the sphere of logic. It grasps neither the two extremes nor the middle. This is the training which culminates in Nibbāna. We put forward these ideas more or less as a commentary to the two verses in question. Let us now turn our attention again to these two verses. Jati marana samsaraṃ ye vajanti punappunang ithi bhava nyatha bhavaṃ avijjayeva sagati. Here we have two peculiar terms. Itha bhava, anyatha bhava, thisness and otherwiseness. What is called birth and death is tantamount to an alternation between thisness and otherwiseness. Just ponder over this statement. So, this alternation is merely a journey of ignorance. It is not someone's journey, only a journey of ignorance. Therefore, ignorance is a vast delusion, mahamoho, as stated in the second verse. However, the two most important terms are ittha bhava and anyatha bhava. As you might recall, while discussing Mahanidāna Sutta, we happened to mention that the Buddha, in his questioning of Venerable Ñāṇananda, step by step, about the mutual relationship between consciousness and name and form, posed the following question. Ananda, if consciousness, having descended into the mother's womb, slips out, will name and form get born into a state of thisness, ithatta? There we came across the term ithatta. Ithatta is none other than ittha bhava, just as nānatta is a synonym for nāna bhava. Granted that ithatta means ittha bhava, we can gather something about it from the above reference itself. So it is only so long as consciousness and name and form are found together in a mother's womb that we can expect the birth of a child. As we happened to mention in that context, if consciousness slips out, only a ball of flesh would come out of the womb. It is only when these two continue to be together that a child is born into this world as thisness. This is because when the newborn child looks around, he finds himself born into a world of 6 sense spheres. From this point of view, it is a thisness. Therefore, thisness is equivalent to birth. Otherwiseness is his journey towards decay and death. So then, thisness and otherwiseness is an inseparable pair. The worldling tries to separate birth from death and keep back birth and reject death. But this is an impossibility. It is an inseparable pair. So it is clear that thisness, itabhava, is birth. The moment one grasps something as this, giving it a thingness, it starts becoming otherwise. He comes under the inescapable law of impermanence. Therefore, itabhava and anyatabhava are tantamount to birth and death. The alternation between them in samsara is merely a journey of ignorance. Avidjayeva sa gati. There is an important discourse which brings out the implications of the two terms, itabhava and anyatabhava. Although we happened to discuss it earlier too, we take it up again because it is relevant. Soon after his enlightenment, the Buddha, as he was seated cross-legged under the Bodhi tree in Uruvela on the banks of river Neranjara, arising from his concentration, after 7 days, surveyed the world with his Buddha eye, and uttered this verse as a paean of joy. It is a powerful utterance, showing how deeply he reflected on the pathetic condition of the world. Ayang loko santapajato passapareto rogang vadati attato yena hi manyati tato tang hoti anyatha. This grief-stricken world, given over to contact, speaks of a disease in terms of a self. Whatever thing he thinks in terms of, thereby itself it turns otherwise. In the introductory part of this discourse, it is said that the Buddha, in surveying the world with his Buddha eye, saw beings stricken with grief due to various burning sensations born of lust, hate, and delusion, and uttered this verse. The world is grief-stricken and enslaved by contact, santapajato passapareto, and calls a disease or a nest of diseases, i.e. the body, a self, rogang vadati attato. What happens as a result of taking this nest of diseases as a self? Now comes a significant statement. Yena hi manyati, tato tang hoti anyatha. Whatever one thinks in terms of, thereby it turns otherwise. The newly born child thinks, I am in this world, and with that very thought, the germ of impermanence takes over, and that itself is the beginning of turning otherwise, or change. Then the Buddha goes on to explain what happens as a result of this minding, manyana. Anyatha bhavi bhavasatto loko bhavapareto bhavame vabhinandati yada bhinandati tang bhayang yassa bhayati tang dukkhang bhavavipahanaya ko panidang brahmacharyang vussati. The world attached to becoming and given over to becoming, though becoming otherwise, yet delights in becoming. What it delights in is a cause for fear, and what it is scared of is suffering itself. But for abandoning that becoming is this holy life lived. This is an extraordinary analysis of the predicament the world finds itself in. The nature of the world is to become otherwise, due to the inexorable law of impermanence. But the world, i.e., the worldlings, is attached to becoming and given over to becoming. Attatha bhavi bhavasatto loko bhavapareto. It therefore delights in becoming. Bhava meva bhinandati. The very fact that it delights is a fear, a dread. Yada bhinandati tang bhayang. What is fearful or dreadful is suffering. Yassa bhayati tang dukkhang. Then comes the solution to the problem. It is for the abandoning of becoming that this holy life is lived. Bhava vippahanaya ko panidang brahmachariyang vussati. Just ponder over this paradoxical situation. It is in the nature of becoming to become otherwise. But the worldling is attached to and given over to becoming. In fact, it delights in becoming, which itself is a cause of fear. What it is apprehensive of is suffering, bound up with the inexorable law of impermanence. Then the Buddha makes this significant declaration. Whatever recluses or Brahmins spoke of release from existence by means of existence, I say that they are not released from existence. Whatever recluses or Brahmins who spoke of a stepping out of existence by means of non-existence, I say that they all have not stepped out of existence. All this suffering arises due to assets. By the destruction of all grasping, there is no arising of suffering. A peculiar word came up in this discourse, namely, manyati. Earlier too we called manyana a minding, a thinking, in terms of it is a fancying, in other words, caused by ignorance. Once born into the world, the child fancies itself to be a mannequin. Parents take it to be their own child. This combination of name and form and consciousness. Whether it likes it or not, there is growth, which in effect is decay. The Buddha speaks only of birth, decay, and death, not of any growth as such. From birth itself, change takes over. That is to say, from birth itself, there is a progress towards decay and death. The world is imprisoned within this duality. And that is what the Buddha calls suffering. Scholars suggest all sorts of etymologies for the word dukkha. We, in our own way, suggested a certain etymology in our Nibbāna sermons. Du means with difficulty or hardship, and kha means bearing up. So dukkha means though with difficulty one bears up. Though one bears up, it is difficult. Let me give a simple simile as an illustration. In fact, I gave a simile of a serpent circle. I borrowed the idea from a cartoon I saw in my boyhood. The cartoon had 3 cages or windows. The first cage showed 2 serpents, say a cobra and a viper, trying to swallow each other. In the first cage, the viper's tail is shown to be in the cobra's mouth, while the cobra's tail is in the viper's mouth. The second cage showed that the cobra has swallowed half of the viper, and that the viper has swallowed half of the cobra. That means now we have a serpent circle. Try to guess what could be in the third cage. Let us for a moment think that the cobra has swallowed the viper. Then the viper is not visible. If the viper has swallowed the cobra, the latter would not be visible. Whatever it is, the third cage only showed a few short lines in the center suggestive of a void. But is it a possibility? Can they successfully swallow each other? It is a possibility only in the realm of logic, never in the world of reality. So, the actual situation in the world is as represented by the second cage, the serpent circle. It is a conflict, a deadlock. The cobra has to bear up somehow, though it is difficult to do so. It started swallowing but cannot finish it. Same with the viper's attempt to swallow the cobra. Though it is difficult, both have to bear up. Though they bear up, it is difficult. They are in a fix. Well, this is our predicament too. You talk about income and expenditure. It is a similar attempt to swallow up, whether at state level or household level. Husband and wife are in conflict with regard to income and expenditure. Income tries to swallow up expenditure, and expenditure tries to swallow up income. In economics, there is the risk of inflation. Between supply and demand, there is another serpent circle. Just think about the society at large, institutions, and the like. Duties try to swallow up rights, and rights try to swallow up duties. The result is strikes. What about our in-breath and out-breath, and our blood circulation? It is the same conflict everywhere. This is the suffering. But the world refuses to understand this precarious situation for what it is. Instead, it goes on craving for existence, for birth, again and again. It craves for birth, but abhors death. This is the tragic comedy before us. Talking about this liking for birth and disliking for death, let us bring up a little simile in the form of a parable. However much we explain this deep point, some of you might not grasp it. But when it comes in the form of a simile, it is easily understood. Let us take one from the village life itself. Simple Siadoris, the habitual drunkard, suddenly dies. Usually in the case of a sudden death, a post-mortem is held. But before the formal inquest, there is a tendency in the village to hold many informal inquests. First of all, let us consult the venerable chief monk. His verdict is that his lay supporter, Siadoris, died because he could not keep the fifth precept, i.e., abstinence from intoxicants. Now, let us ask the village schoolmaster. His opinion is that this premature death is due to illiteracy. What does the member of the parliament say? He would put it down to abject poverty due to misgovernment by the ruling party. Let us ask the wife of the dead man, who was at his bedside at the time of the death. She might say that her husband died because he could not breathe. What is the coroner's verdict? It states that the death is due to chronic cirrhosis. But all these are partial truths. If we ask the Buddha, he would say that Siadoris died for the simple reason that he was born. There you are laughing. But that is the fact. Of course, you might say, you don't have to tell us that. We know that. But that is precisely what has to be told. That is what the world does not know. You may recall what we pointed out in our discussion of the Mahapadana Sutta. When we analyze the Paṭicca Samuppāda formula these days, we usually begin with the first two lines. Avidya paccaya sankhara, dependent on ignorance, preparations. It is very easy for us now. But how did the Buddha lay bare this most wonderful truth for the first time? It is through radical attention, yoniso manasikara. Yoniso manasikara means attending by way of the source or matrix. Therefore, not only our Gautama Buddha, but also Vipassi Buddha before him, aroused the knowledge of dependent arising by attending to decay and death upwards. We have already explained these things. For instance, the Bodhisattva Vipassi asked himself, Kim hi nu ko sati jara maranang hoti? King paccaya jara maranang? When what is there, or what being there, does decay and death come to be? Dependent on what is decay and death? Then it occurred to him, Jatiya sati jara maranang hoti, jati paccaya jara maranang. When birth is there, decay and death come to be. Dependent on birth is decay and death. Just see. There is nothing to laugh about it. Until then, the world had not understood it. The worldlings only think up excuses for it. That is why they ask why a Buddha has to come and tell us that. But the Buddhas arouse the knowledge of this basic reason because they want to put an end to samsaric suffering. Worldlings are not concerned with radical solutions to the problem of suffering. Whether he observed the 5 precepts or not, Siyadoris would die. Whether he is literate or illiterate, he would die. Whether he held his breath or released it, he would die. Whether he had cirrhosis or not, he would die. But if Siyadoris had put an end to birth, he would not have died. To refresh your memory a little more, now you can make sense of the Paṭicca Samuppāda formula, because radical attention starts from the very end. Then the Buddha asked himself, Kim hi nu ko sati jati hoti? Kim paccaya jati? When what is there does birth come to be? Dependent on what is birth? And it dawned on him through wisdom. Bhave ko sati jati hoti? Bhava paccaya jati. When becoming is there, does birth come to be? Dependent on becoming is birth. So, you can infer that the condition for birth is becoming or existence. And likewise, the cause and condition for becoming or existence is grasping, because what you grasp, that you are. The condition for grasping is craving, since you grasp because of craving. The condition for craving is feeling, since you crave because of feeling. The condition for feeling is contact, because where you contact, there you feel. The condition for contact is the 6 sense spheres, since you contact because you have 6 sense spheres. The condition for the 6 sense spheres is name and form. Now we come to that deep point which we discussed earlier too. The condition for name and form is consciousness. And then there is that crucial turning back. The condition for consciousness is name and form. The process of questioning through radical attention stopped at the point of this mutual conditionality. Anyam anya paccayata. Nama rupa paccaya viññānaṃ. Viññāna paccaya nama rupang. Dependent on name and form is consciousness. Dependent on consciousness is name and form. Although questioning stopped there, the very ignorance of this mental conditionality itself is avidya, or ignorance, and the consequent fumbling or groping about in that darkness is sankhara, or preparations. This is what we try to illustrate by various similes, the delusion arising out of the duality. The tragic self-love of Narcissus is the best example. But the Buddha discovered the secret of this vortical interplay, namely, dependent arising, Paṭicca Samuppāda. That he accomplished through radical attention. So, you may understand that this discourse, which is regarded as deep, reveals that dependent arising, or Paṭicca Samuppāda, is a middle path. It is due to a lack of understanding of this fact that many find it difficult to understand that the cessation of becoming is Nibbāna. We might have to take up for discussion several other deep discourses to clarify this aspect of the Dhamma. Then there is what is called Maññana, literally minding, thinking in terms of or imagining. Let us take up a short discourse to acquaint ourselves with this term and to clarify further the alternation between thisness and otherwiseness. Ithabhava, anyathabhava. We pointed out that Maññana is an imagining. According to what the Buddha has pointed out to us, we are living in a mirage of our own making. The mirage is mind-made. To reveal this fact to us, he brings up a strange parable, the parable of Vepacitti in Samyutta Nikāya. It is a parable which conveys something extremely deep. The Buddha presents it to the monks as if relating an incident which actually happened in the past. Quite often in the discourses, we find an allusion to a battle between gods, sura, and demons, asura. In this particular contest, it is said that in the battle between gods and demons, demons lost and gods won. The gods bound Vepacitti, the king of demons, in a fivefold bondage, neck, hand, and foot, and brought him into the presence of Sakka, the king of gods. The Buddha says that the bondage of Vepacitti has a peculiar mechanism about it. When Vepacitti thinks gods are righteous and demons are unrighteous, I will remain here in the Deva world. With that very thought, he finds himself released from the fivefold bondage and enjoying divine pleasures. But as soon as he thinks gods are unrighteous and demons are righteous, I will go back to the Asura world. He finds himself bound again in that fivefold bondage. The point here stressed by the Buddha is that the bondage is mind-made. In summing up, the Buddha says, Evang sukhamang ko bhikkhave vepacitti bandhanang tato sukhumatarang mara bandhanang. So subtle, monks, is the bondage of Vepacitti, but more subtle still the bondage of Mara. The bondage of Vepacitti is subtle, as it is connected with the mind. But it seems the bondage of Mara is subtler. Now comes the highly significant statement. Maññanmano ko bhikkhave baddho maras amanyanmano mutto papimato. Imagining, monks, one is bound by Mara. Not imagining, one is freed from that evil one. Then the Buddha goes on to explain what this imagining is. Asmiti bhikkhave manyitametang. Ayam mahamasmiti manyitametang. Bhavissanti manyitametang. Na bhavissanti manyitametang. Rupi bhavissanti manyitametang. Arupi bhavissanti manyitametang. Sanyi bhavissanti manyitametang. asanye bhavissanti manyitametang, neva sanye na sanye bhavissanti manyitametang, manyitang bhikkave gando, manyitang rogo, manyitang sallang, tasmatiha bhikkave amanitamane cetasa viharissamati evanhi vo bhikkave sikhitabang. I am, monks, this is an imagined. This I am, this is an imagined. I should be, monks, this is an imagined. I shall not be, monks, this is an imagined. I shall be one with form, monks, this is an imagined. I shall be formless, monks, this is an imagined. I shall be percipient, monks, this is an imagined. I shall be non-percipient, monks, this is an imagined. I shall be percipient nor non-percipient, monks, this is an imagined. Imagining, monks, is a disease. Imagining is an abscess. Imagining is a barb. Therefore, monks, you must tell yourselves, we will dwell with a mind free from imaginings. Thus must you train yourselves. So here are 9 ways of imagining. The first imagining is I am. We cannot help using I am according to rules of grammar. But that itself is something imagined. That is not enough. We have to say, this am I, identifying ourselves with one or the other of 5 aggregates. But that again is something imagined. So also is the assertion, I shall be, or I shall not be. Similarly, even the Brahmas are bound, since I shall be one with form, and I shall be formless are imaginings. Whether one thinks I shall be percipient or I shall be non-percipient, it is an imagining. So also the seesawing, I shall be neither percipient nor non-percipient. Having thus shown that the entire range of existence rests on imaginings, the Buddha declares, imagining is a disease, an abscess, a barb, and advises the monks to dwell with a mind free from imaginings. This is the moral behind the parable of Vepachitti's bondage. That is why we pointed out that delusion is ingrained in the linguistic medium. But we cannot afford to reject it altogether. That is precisely why even the Buddha uses it, but without grasping. The other day, while discussing the simile of the whirlpool, we said something about that place and this place, or here and there. Corresponding to that, we have the 3 persons. I am, the first person. Here you are, the second person in front of me, and he over there is the third person. That is the grammatical structure. There are verbs that go with the 3 persons, am, are, and is. According to the Buddha, all these are part and parcel of the disease of imagining. The world is imprisoned by language and logic. The Buddha, on the other hand, offered us a Dhamma that transcends logic. That, in short, is the middle path implicit in the law of dependent arising. I wonder whether you remember our simile of the magic kettle. It is not something found in books. It is based on a little bit of experience in my young days. While on a shopping round, we once watched a continuous flow of water from a kettle into a basin behind a shop window. The kettle never got empty, nor did the basin overflow. We later learned that a hidden tube conveyed the water from the basin back into the kettle. The world is also such a magic kettle. Samudayo, samudayo, arising, arising. There is an incessant process of arising. Nirodho, nirodho, ceasing, ceasing. There is an incessant process of ceasing. But the worldling ignores the ceasing aspect and emphasizes the arising aspect in order to hold on to the personality view, Sakkaya Ditthi. Just ponder over the etymology of the term, Sakkaya Ditthi. Sat means existing, and Kaya means group. It is because we take the entire group or the heap as existing that we insist on proving an identity which we do not have in reality. We have our identity cards. How can there be an identity if the nature of the world is otherwiseness, anyata bhava? Forgetting about this fact, we assert, saying, "This is me," not only our present form, but even the beautiful photographs taken in our childhood or at our wedding. That conceit is implicit in the stance am. The perception of the compact ghana sanya is already there. The world forgets that there is an incessant process of arising and an incessant process of ceasing. This process defies language. When we say river flows, there is only a process of flowing. But when we give it a name, say River Kelani, then we presume that it is the river that flows. So also is the fluxional nature of this body, which is concealed. Only a Buddha points it out to us. Though our commentators failed to notice it, some Buddhist sects highlighted the fact that the middle path which avoids the two extremes is Paṭicca Samuppāda. They give it prominence. This does not mean that we accept everything in those Buddhist sects. Some called it sunyata. The important point to note is that there is an incessant arising and ceasing which transcends logic, because logic is based on the duality of existence and non-existence, on is and is not. Even the four-cornered logic, the tetralemma, moves within this same duality. In place of this, the Buddha introduced the law of dependent arising, with its philosophy of incessant arising and ceasing, summed up in the exclamation, Samudayo, samudayo, nirodho, nirodho. Let us reflect a little more on this imagining I am. How does it come in? There is an important discourse which explains it for us. Once Venerable Ñāṇananda tells his fellow monks, "Friends, when we were newly gone forth, Venerable Punna Mantaniputta was very helpful to us. He gave us an admonition like this: Ananda, upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Ananda, the notion I am, occurs in dependence, not without dependence. That is to say, due to grasping and not without grasping. So the notion I am occurs due to causes and conditions, not fortuitously." Then Venerable Ñāṇananda reiterates the words of Venerable Punna Mantaniputta. Kincha upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Rupang upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Vedanang upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Sanyang upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Sankhare upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Vijnanam upadaya asmiti hoti no anupadaya. Dependent on form arises the notion I am, not without dependence. Dependent on feeling arises the notion I am, not without dependence. Dependent on perception arises the notion I am, not without dependence. Dependent on preparations arises the notion I am, not without dependence. Dependent on consciousness arises the notion I am, not without dependence. So it seems that the notion I am is fostered by grasping or upadana. Then Venerable Punna Mantaniputta gives a wonderful simile. It is a deep simile which you may ponder upon. Just as Ananda, a young woman or a young man who likes adornment, looking at the reflection of her or his face, either in a clean mirror or in a bowl of clear water, would be seeing depending on it, and not without depending. Even so, Ananda, depending on form arises the notion I am, not without depending. Depending on feeling arises the notion I am, not without depending. Depending on perception arises the notion I am, not without depending. Depending on preparations arises the notion I am, not without depending. Depending on consciousness arises the notion I am, not without depending. It is when one grasps the mirror that one sees one's form reflected on it. Now think of what happened to Narcissus. Because he had never seen his face, as soon as he saw the reflection of his face in the water, he imagined an angel in the pond. The notion I am is the result of a similar reflection. The reflection in the mirror does not reveal what is inside the entrails. It only shows the external form. That is what the world prides on as self. One grasps not only form, but feeling, perception, preparations, and consciousness as well. The Buddha has clarified to us why each of them is called a group, khanda. On a previous occasion, too, we explained the significance of the word khanda in Panchupadana Khanda, the 5 groups of grasping. The Buddha has given us an 11-fold analysis of each of the groups. For instance, in the case of form, the formula runs as follows. Yankinchi rupang atita-nāgata paccupannang ajhatang va bahidda va olarikang va sukumang va hinang va panitang va yang dure santike va sabbang rupang, etc. Whatever form, whether past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all form, etc. This 11-fold analysis is recommended for insight meditation to eradicate the conceit of self. Let us try to clarify for ourselves the significance of this analysis. Yankinchi rupang atita-nāgata paccupannang. Whatever form, whether past, future, or present. Even the past form is prided on as my own. That beautiful child in your photo album, you claim with pride, "This is me." So that is your past form. What about the future form? When you are getting ready to go for a wedding, you do a lot of makeup before the mirror and ask yourself, how would I appear there? That is your future form. You have already grasped. Ajhatang va bahidha va, internal or external. You grasp not only your form, but forms you see outside. Olarikang va sukumang va, whether gross or subtle. Hinang va panitang va, inferior or superior. Yang dure santike va sabbang rupang, whether far or near. Every one of the 5 groups is an aggregate of these 11 modes. A person deposits his experiences in life according to these 11 modes. This applies not only to one's present life, but to one's entire samsaric past. This is the bedrock of samsaric experience, which influences one as a latency, anusaya. So then, we have before us a stupendous samsaric problem of the highest order. But we are not going to blame language for it. Language is of our own creation. After we created it, we fell under its spell. That is what we pointed out in our discussion of the term papancha. We alluded to the legend about a resurrected tiger. 3 experts in magic, while going through a forest, saw the scattered bones of a tiger. One magic worker showed his skill by assembling them into a skeleton. The second one gave it flesh and blood. The third one infused life into it. The magically resurrected tiger sprang up and devoured all of them. Our language and logic worked a similar tragedy on us. We have been imprisoned by language and logic in this samsara. That is why we said in an earlier sermon that the complications in samsara are traceable to linguistic conventions. That is not with the idea of stigmatizing it. In fact, we cannot help using it. Even the Buddha had to use it. As the grand finale of the Paṭicca Sutta comes the following highly significant statement. Iti ma ko citta loka samanya loka niruttiyo loka vohara loka panyattiyo yahi tathagato voharati aparamasang. Citta, these are worldly conventions, worldly expressions, worldly usages, worldly concepts, which the Tathagata makes use of without grasping. The Tathagata makes use of them, but does not grasp them. That should be the aim of following this Dhamma. Therefore, it is from the misconceptions ingrained in the linguistic medium that we have to get free from. That can be accomplished only through insight and wisdom. By continuously seeing the arising and ceasing nature of phenomena in one's experience with insight, we can extricate ourselves from these misconceptions, and that, too, each one by himself. So, I think this is enough for today. It seems we are delving deeper and deeper into this Dhamma. But you shouldn't get disheartened. These sermons may not be as palatable as popular versified sermons, but it is here that we have the quintessence of the Dhamma. As we once told you, if you wish to attain Nibbāna after seeing the Buddha, see Paṭicca Samuppāda. If you see Paṭicca Samuppāda, you see the Dhamma, and whoever sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. So, when you see Paṭicca Samuppāda, you see both the Buddha and the Dhamma. You had better reflect wisely on these words. I suppose you spent the day in meditation, established on higher precepts. Today, you had the opportunity to listen to a sermon which is particularly relevant to insight meditation. Making the best use of it in your meditation, I hope you all will put forth your best efforts to escape this terrible samsara. May you all be able to attain in this very life supramundane states and the bliss of the deathless Nibbāna. Whatever beings there be, from the lowest hell to the highest Brahma world, may they all rejoice in our sermon. May the merits accrued by that rejoicing conduce to the fulfillment of their higher aims. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.